trumpet when I was about 14, and I eventually traded it in for a guitar.
Yeah, you just
asking him first, saying, "Do you mind?" And he said, "I don't mind." No, I couldn't sing with it in my mouth.
He was the one no one suspected. Always in control, always one step ahead. Paul McCartney didn't just survive the Beatles, he pulled strings no one saw. That polished exterior, a shield for something much colder. He didn't hold the band together, he fractured it, quietly, precisely. Every harmony masked a hidden agenda, every silence a decision to let someone else fall. Was Paul the quiet genius, or the mastermind behind the breakups, betrayals, and buried truths that tore legends apart? The world loved to paint John and Paul as musical soulmates, but when the lights went down, their relationship was a battlefield, littered with resentment. Paul's control in the studio grew unbearable to Lennon, who once called him insufferable and accused him of trying to hijack the Beatles' legacy. Their feud escalated into public potshots, veiled lyrics, and media shade. Paul's too cute leadership style slowly morphed into domination. He fought to keep the Beatles together, but on his terms. When Lennon finally left, Paul spun the narrative as betrayal, filing lawsuits to dissolve the band. Fans saw heartbreak. Insiders saw cold strategy. While Paul loved the image of the doting husband and devoted father, stories behind the scenes whispered otherwise. Rumors of flings, even during his marriage to Linda, flickered through the tabloids. There were whispers of an affair with a backing singer and tensions with fellow musicians over Paul's flirtations backstage. But the most controversial, his explosive second marriage to Heather Mills. The relationship descended into tabloid hell. Lawsuits, accusations of abuse, and a bitter divorce that painted Paul in a far less saintly light. She called him controlling, emotionally cold, and obsessed with image. He countered with silence, and a PR machine ready to bury her. While the world focused on John and Paul, few noticed how George simmered under Paul's thumb. McCartney often dismissed George's songs, sidelined his contributions, and took over sessions with ruthless precision. George once snapped, "I'll play what you want me to play, or I won't play at all." Their dynamic was less brotherhood, more dictatorship. George's masterpieces like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps were his rebellion. Subtle digs at the man who treated him like a junior, and even post-Beatles, the bitterness never truly faded. Wings may have brought Paul back to stardom, but the cost? Total control. He hired musicians who obeyed, not challenged. Multiple ex-members admitted they walked on eggshells around him.
So Ringo remembered him never standing during the whole evening. That was Ringo's key memory. Mine was of him meeting us at the door. So there was the anthology.
Right.
Paul wrote the songs, called the shots, and expected loyalty at all costs. Denny Laine, once his closest ally in Wings, later spoke of financial unfairness and emotional exhaustion. Paul didn't run a band, he ran an empire, and everyone else were just players in his script. Paul's list of enemies didn't end with ex-Beatles. He clashed with Phil Spector over the orchestration of Let It Be, publicly criticized Michael Jackson for outbidding him for the Beatles' catalog, and had long-running spats with Yoko Ono over credits, song rights, and legacy. Even Elvis Costello, who once collaborated with Paul, called him difficult, brilliant, yes, but overbearing and too obsessed with control. Collaborations often started with excitement and ended with exhaustion. Millions saw romance. But behind the velvet curtain, Paul McCartney was setting emotional fires he never intended to put out. His engagement to Jane Asher had all the trappings of a dream, but in truth, it was a ticking bomb. She moved into his life, into his world, only to walk in on him with Francie Schwartz. It wasn't just betrayal, it was demolition. The fallout was swift and brutal. Jane left, shattered. But Paul? He didn't explain, didn't apologize. He let the media turn it into a misunderstanding, while the truth, the cruelty, was buried beneath headlines and charm. He didn't just end a love story, he destroyed it and walked away as if nothing had burned. During the Beatles' early U.S. triumph, whispers spoke of Paul's hidden liaison with actress Peggy Lipton. They were photographed together, romance rumored to stretch across tour dates and hotel rooms. It wasn't a playful fling. It was a secret he carried into his marriage with Linda. And when Linda arrived, those women vanished. But the emotional wreckage remained. Friends later revealed that Linda knew not everything, but enough. Enough to cast a shadow over their early years. Lipton, too, reportedly struggled with the emotional fallout, feeling discarded, silenced, and rewritten out of history by a man whose image had no room for imperfection. And in the silence that followed, one truth rang louder than any melody Paul ever wrote. This secret love had left real scars. Paul's second marriage turned from fairy tale to courtroom spectacle. Heather Mills accused him of emotional manipulation, of living in a world where he controlled everything. In public, he maintained composure. In private, forensics revealed a man unwilling to yield control. When their marriage collapsed, it fractured more than a home. It shattered a public image built on peace. The divorce became legal warfare, complete with sob stories and million-pound settlements. But behind the polished PR statements were vicious power plays. Allegations of verbal cruelty and icy silence emerged, painting Paul as a man more obsessed with reputation than reconciliation. Friends close to the couple spoke of cold dinners, shouting matches behind closed doors, and Heather's growing paranoia in a house where nothing felt safe. For Paul, love had become another campaign to manage, and Heather, just another conflict to bury. Even friendly admirers didn't escape the sting of McCartney's sharp edges. Phil Collins, once a wide-eyed admirer and fellow icon, approached Paul with the kind of reverence only a true fan can muster. But what he received in return wasn't warmth. It was dismissal. A sarcastic jab, a mocking tone, a moment so belittling that Collins would never forget it. Collins later called the exchange really condescending, but beneath that polite summary was real pain. A sense of betrayal from someone he once idolized. That brief encounter tore through the illusion of brotherhood among music's elite and left behind a chill that never truly thawed. What could have been a legendary alliance between two greats turned into decades of silence. McCartney didn't just brush him off. He cut deep, and in doing so, reminded the world that even behind the curtain of charm, Paul could wield cruelty like a blade. Behind the closed doors of the Let It Be sessions, Paul McCartney found himself in a storm of artistic warfare. Phil Spector, armed with his infamous wall of sound, dared to take liberties with the Beatles' final recordings, drowning Paul's minimalism in dramatic excess. To Paul, it was nothing short of vandalism. The orchestral swell on The Long and Winding Road wasn't a flourish, it was an insult, a violation, one that Paul never forgave. But the deeper wound came from Yoko Ono. As John's partner, she wasn't just present, she was omnipresent. A looming shadow in sessions once sacred, Paul resented her influence, her input, her control over John's time, ideas, and loyalty. What began as awkward tension turned into Cold War. Creative disagreements became personal digs. Disputes over songwriting credits and legacy became battles that spilled into courts, books, and documentaries. Their feud wasn't a flare-up, it was a slow-burning fire that lasted decades, and while others sought peace, Paul refused to let go. Not when the art, the brotherhood, and the legacy he'd fought to preserve were at stake. For him, it wasn't just about music. It was about ownership, of vision, of truth, of the Beatles themselves. When Michael Jackson acquired the rights to the Beatles catalog in 1985, it wasn't just a business deal. It was a detonation. Paul McCartney, who had once gently advised Jackson on the value of publishing rights, found himself outplayed by his younger friend in the most humiliating way. Paul had hoped to reclaim what he believed was his musical legacy. Instead, Jackson made a power move that felt like a personal betrayal. Paul didn't just disagree, he seethed. He labeled the move wrong and unscrupulous, accusing Jackson of corporate greed and stabbing him in the back. He believed he'd been used, first as a mentor, then as a stepping stone. Their friendly collaboration on songs like Say, Say, Say suddenly felt like a setup. Jackson, for his part, remained silent, letting his business acumen speak louder than any lyric. What followed wasn't just awkward tension, it was a cold, calculated rivalry. Paul began avoiding public mention of Michael. He lobbied behind the scenes to regain the catalog, but the damage was done. The clash exposed the cracks in McCartney's carefully curated image. Not just the victim, but a man deeply wounded by losing control. Their feud became a quiet war, one that never saw reconciliation, only silence and scars. Paul McCartney may sing of love, but those who stood behind the velvet ropes saw something very different. To the public, he was warmth and wit, an eternal charmer. But behind studio doors and boardroom tables, he played a colder game. Insiders whispered of a man who didn't just shape history, he edited it to his favor. He didn't just rewrite Beatles history in documentaries, he choreographed the narrative, slicing away the inconvenient truths, the tensions, the betrayals, the power plays. They were whitewashed behind nostalgia. Every shot was curated, every smile rehearsed like a scene in a play. And while others crumbled under the weight of their demons, Paul stayed afloat. Not because he was cleaner, but because he was smarter. He wasn't the wild one, he wasn't the tragic one, but he was the coldest survivor, the one who always stayed just ahead of the fire, letting others burn while he walked away untouched. He didn't shout, he calculated. He didn't feud in the open, he wielded silence like a sword. While Lennon exploded, George withdrew, and Ringo drifted. Paul played chess. And in the end, he didn't just survive the Beatles, he outmaneuvered them all. And that's the haunting brilliance of Paul McCartney. A man whose harmony masked havoc, and whose survival came not through kindness, but through quiet, ruthless control. He still fills stadiums, he still earns applause. But behind the scenes, there's a trail of bruised egos, abandoned allies, and unresolved wars. Paul McCartney didn't just shape pop music, he bent it to his will. And those who got in the way, they either folded or disappeared. Because in the end, maybe the real McCartney story isn't about harmony, it's about control. And the charming Beatle, he just hid his ruthlessness better than the rest.